Welcome everyone to my European winter forecast update. We have now reached November, so I have some new information to present. For my Europe winter forecast update, we're going to be taking a deep dive into other things like the QBO and how this affects other common weather anomalies such as the jet stream and the polar vortex. We will learn how these things work together and why it could mean a colder winter for parts of Europe. With this in mind, let's get started with this important information. First things first, the climate drivers. One thing that you may not hear much about is the QBO, which stands for the quasi-biennial oscillation. The QBO is a regular variation in the winds blowing high above the equator at an altitude of about 15 to 50 kilometers above our heads. You can see here on the latest wind map we have easterly winds over the equator. This is what we expect will persist for the 2023 through 2024 winter. Just like the North Atlantic Oscillation and an El Niño, the QBO has different phases. The easterly phase of the QBO favors a slower jet stream. The jet stream is a belt of winds that drives all the weather across the world. For Europe, the main jet stream is the Atlantic jet stream, and when it's slower, it actually weakens, and that makes it easier for Arctic air to burst southward. Another thing that is more common during an easterly QBO phase is sudden stratospheric warming events. This occurs when the Arctic warms dramatically, taking up all the space, which pushes all the Arctic air outward. When the jet stream is already weakened, this cold air is able to come south. This, in turn, makes it more favorable for extreme cold events in Northern Europe, Russia, Canada, and the US. On the other hand, we have the westerly phase of the QBO, and this means the winds will be moving the opposite direction over the equator. This favors a stronger jet stream, which could mean less cold air and more warm and westerly trends for Europe. This is not what we're expecting for the upcoming winter. So now moving on with the video, let's see what the latest long-range weather models are suggesting. First off, here's a month-by-month walkthrough of what the CANSIPS model is showing. This is going to be really interesting. For November, we're seeing warmer temperatures across much of Europe, especially the further east you go. Scandinavia has also seen some cold air, which I discussed on my November outlook. This has led to early snowfall, especially for central Sweden. But now notice the forecast for December. We see some trends for a big warm-up across Europe, with mainly the UK and Ireland seeing some more neutral shades due to a stormy pattern. But what happens next is what is really interesting. For January, look at how much more cold air is showing up across Europe. Not just in the north, but also the south. Places like the Alps have colder anomalies, which could mean very heavy snow. And then by February, we can see that those temperatures get even colder. We see Eastern Europe continuing to be a little bit warmer than normal, but notice Scandinavia down to the Iberian Peninsula. Is this an indication of a possible sudden stratospheric warming event? It's quite possible. Notice now what this different model shows. This one is a lot more conservative, so you don't see too many colors. Watch how the warmer anomalies back down as we go from December, January, and especially by February, with much of Europe under no colors, which is an indication that warmer air is going to be pushed away. So now switching back over to the CANSIPS model for precipitation in November, it's been dry across western Norway, which has come to fruition, while a strong westerly pattern has prevailed, leading to heavy precipitation across much of Europe. We saw this especially with the month getting kicked off by the major storm that impacted France. By December, we see a warm and westerly pattern persist across northern Europe, with a general storm track going through France, Ireland, the UK, and then spreading into the rest of Europe. Places like Italy, Spain, and northern Africa remain dry. But as we flip the page to 2024, we see big changes, much like the changes in temperature anomalies. In regards to precipitation, we see a northerly storm track cut off quite a bit, with the wetter anomalies heading into southern Europe, which would mean places like the UK, Ireland, and Scandinavia see much less precipitation than normal. This won't mean it won't be rainy or snowy, it just means it will be a lot less. And then by February, we see that general pattern persisting with southerly storms while the north is colder and more easterly. With that said, it's time to review my revised winter outlook. Please enjoy Chapter 3 of today's forecast. Starting off with my precipitation outlook, I'm expecting wetter than normal conditions across southern Europe, especially for January and February. I think that November and December will be rainy at times, but probably a little bit less consistent. The darker green shade is where I think some of the wettest weather is going to be possible. I expect December to be quite stormy before turning drier in January and February. Areas in the darker color over North Ireland, Scotland, and Western Norway is where I think we will see the driest conditions this winter. Now for temperatures, I expect generally warmer weather across much of southern Europe, although I will say that I would not be surprised if the higher elevations, such as the Alps and the Pyrenees mountains, would be colder than normal, since we're going to be having a lot of low pressure systems moving through. Then there's the blue shade, which is where I think cold air is more probable, and this is centered over the Baltic countries and Scandinavia. I think that November is going to continue to be cold, with a warm up in December before cooling back down and possibly with extreme cold for January and February. The areas that aren't in the orange or blue is basically the neutral zone, or where I think the temperatures will vary quite a bit throughout the winter. That region will be susceptible to cold air outbreaks, especially in January and February. And now for the final portion of the video, my overall forecast. For the south, you can expect wetter than average weather from Portugal and Spain all through the Mediterranean Sea, as far east as Turkey. Heavy snow is possible for the higher elevations. Blue shades over the Pyrenees and the Alps is where I think we're going to have a very significant snowfall season, which is due to the wetter than average weather for southern Europe and possibly the colder temperatures. If you are looking for some good ski destinations, I think the Alps and the Pyrenees will be amongst the best choices. Moving on towards northern France, Ireland, the UK, and Norway, you can expect a very stormy November and December before we start to see a significant shift in the storm track, which will likely make way for a drier although colder January and February. Even if the precipitation is lowered, I do think the risk of snowstorms will increase in the second half of winter, so don't let the phrase below normal precipitation make you put your guard down. Next up, the pink shade is where I think we have a bit of a tricky forecast. That's going to be in between the active southern storm track and the cold easterlies to the north, so I'm expecting variable temperatures and the possibility of big snowstorms. In the United States, where I'm used to forecasting, the region that temperatures clash is where we tend to see the biggest storm systems form, so I think that this area in Europe is going to be at the biggest threat of significant winter storms or heavy rainfall depending on your geographical position. The blue area for southern Sweden and Finland can expect a snowy and cold November, a warmer and wet December, and then a drier and colder January into February. While precipitation may be decreased in the second half of winter, I would still be watching for some big snowstorms. And lastly, northern Scandinavia can expect an extremely cold and dry winter. That will conclude today's European winter outlook. If you did enjoy this forecast, definitely consider subscribing to this channel so you receive constant updates on the weather for Europe and the United States. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.